Mr. Nixon, President Johnson today accused you of making ugly and unfair distortions of American defense positions and of his own peacemaking efforts. Do you feel that despite your own moratorium against it, the peace negotiations have now been brought into the political campaign?
I certainly do not, because I made it very clear that in anything I've said about the Vietnam negotiations that I would not discuss what the negotiators should agree to. I believe that President Johnson should have absolute freedom of action to negotiate what he finds is the proper kind of settlement. And under the circumstances, no one on the outside should say that he would agree to this or that. That would mean that the enemy would wait for the presidential candidate to be elected rather than negotiate with the president we've got.
From CBS New York, in color, Face the Nation, a spontaneous and unrehearsed news interview with Richard M. Nixon, Republican candidate for president. Mr. Nixon will be questioned by CBS News correspondent John Hart, David Broder, national political reporter of the Washington Post, and CBS News correspondent Martin Agronsky. Today's interview is brought to you by Masonite Corporation, where the resource is timber and the product is imagination.
Mr. Nixon, the president obviously feels that when you raised the possibility, though you said you did not believe it in it yourself, that the peace negotiations were being linked to an effort to elect Hubert Humphrey. That the president clearly feels that in raising that, you yourself ended your moratorium on bringing peace negotiations into the political campaign. How would you respond to that?
Well, I would respond to it by pointing out that the president reads the newspapers, as I do, and there's been a great deal of discussion. In fact, there was a UPI report from Washington indicating that there was a lot of speculation that there were insiders in the White House staff who were attempting to work out some sort of a settlement and that the president was going to be used for that purpose. And it seemed to me that I was being quite responsible in nailing that and making it clear that I did not share the views of those that thought the president would use these negotiations politically. And incidentally, I don't. I think President Johnson wants to bring this war to an end. I think he'd like to have a bombing pause, provided it isn't going to cost American lives, that it will save lives rather than cost them. I don't go along with those that think that he's going to play politics with this. I made that statement, and I would think the president would be thanking me rather than attacking me.
Mr. Nixon, you referred in that original statement to unnamed top officials, and now you say White House insiders. Who are you talking about?
Well, I'm talking about the people within the White House staff who are supposed to be privy to the various negotiations that are going on. I'm not going to go into any details with regard to the men that are involved. I'm only referring to the reports that have been made. I'm not going to make any charges against any of Mr. Johnson's personal staff. It's apparently quite well known that they do support Hubert Humphrey, perhaps more enthusiastically than he does.
Mr. Nixon, you have repeatedly in your campaign said that you would not do or say anything to pull the rug out from under Mr. Johnson during the negotiations. And this week you accused Mr. Humphrey of having the fastest and loosest tongue in American politics, saying that he is unable to mind his tongue while negotiations are going on. 2 days after you said that about Mr. Humphrey, you revealed that part of the negotiations Mr. Johnson was now engaging in concerned a possible ceasefire. Now, if you were president, would you consider that revelation a kind of rug pulling?
I would if it were a revelation. But as you certainly know, Mr. Hart, from reading the papers and listening to CBS News, the ceasefire had been talked about for weeks before. Everybody knows the reports out of Paris from Mr. Harriman and the rest. The two things, they were talking about the possibility of a bombing halt and the possibility of a ceasefire. I was only repeating what I had heard on CBS and read in the papers.
Mr. Nixon, I wonder if we could end this whole discussion on raising this business of connecting the peace negotiations with the election of Mr. Humphrey by asking you this. Why, if you didn't believe it, did you raise it at all?
Because it seemed to me that with all the speculation that was going on, the speculation that there was about to be a bombing pause and that it would be negotiated for political reasons, that it was important for the man most intimately involved. I would be the man, I suppose, that was supposed to be harmed by a bombing pause, although I'm not sure that's the case. It was important for me to nail it once and for all. After all, if the president's going to be able to negotiate a settlement here, the enemy must not get the impression that he has to negotiate for political reasons. that reduces his ability to negotiate. And incidentally, talking about this loosest tongue thing that John Hart referred to a moment ago with regard to Mr. Humphrey, he has said that he is for a bombing before a bombing pause without conditions at one time, with conditions at another time. He was for the Vietnam peace plank at one time, against it at another time. It's that kind of vacillation that I think creates in the minds of the men in Hanoi and the impression that if they'll only wait, they may get a better deal from the next man. And that's why I've been consistent throughout. I made it clear that as far as I was concerned, President Johnson was our president. He's the man that must negotiate at this time, and that I would support him provided he negotiated a bombing pause on the very basis that he said he would insist upon.
Mr. Nixon, excuse me.
Go on.
In your radio speech for tonight, you say that you will support the president if he decides that a bombing halt would speed peace and save American lives. And yet, not very long ago, you were criticizing Mr. Humphrey for saying that he would also risk a bombing halt under these exact same stipulations.
Yes, but Mr. Broder, you'll remember that Mr. Humphrey, depended on which news release you read, the first wire release that came off, the first release that came off the AP wire, said that Mr. Humphrey was for a bombing halt, period. 3 hours later, through a backgrounder, they indicated that there would be certain conditions. And then throughout Mr. Humphrey's discussion since then, and one day he's been for a bombing halt, period. On other occasions, he said he's for a bombing halt, provided it isn't going to cost American lives.
Well,
my point is that I think we ought to be consistent on this, and I think President Johnson has been consistent. I've been consistent. Mr. Humphrey ought to get in line, be with his president for a change.
Well, reading back through some of your recent statements on this subject, I noticed in an interview in Pittsburgh on September 8th, you said, and I quote you, "I have constantly said we must keep the military pressure on. That is why I, for example, would oppose a bombing pause, as we make clear to the enemy that we want to negotiate." Does that represent a change of viewpoint on your part?
Oh, not at all. The whole purpose of that statement is to make clear, as I had made clear if you'd read the whole speech, and I'm sure you did, what I was pointing out is that we had to have a negotiated end of the war. The bombing halt is the major card we have to play in order to bring the enemy to negotiate on some kind of terms. You don't give it away by simply saying, well, I'll have a bombing halt, and then hoping the enemy will negotiate. That means you may not get a negotiation. I think President Johnson has been absolutely correct in saying that he will not have a bombing halt unless we get something in return. That's the position I tried to take in Pittsburgh. That's my position now.
May I replay a word, if I can remember correctly, what you said earlier, and that is that in regards to the ceasefire provision, there had been speculation on CBS News and on UPI, and this is what you were quoting was a speculation. Is that correct, what you said this evening?
Yes, as far as my own recollection is.
All right, well, then what you said later, if you'll permit me to go on, was that you had confirmed that these reports were true. Now, this is the first time any public official, certainly, or any person of your stature, had confirmed that a ceasefire was connected with the current negotiations. Now, that goes back to the point of my original question, which was, would this not undermine, or would it, in your mind, undermine any kind of negotiations for Mr. Johnson, by confirming that this was part of it?
Let me make one thing very clear. We have to separate President Johnson from people within the White House staff and others who may represent a different point of view, because it's common knowledge that there are that President Johnson has divided opinion on this particular matter within his administration. That's been reported also on CBS News, as I'm sure you know. But in this particular instance, you will find that President Johnson has always insisted that the bombing halt is a separate matter. However, the ceasefire is something that I would assume the administration would also want if they could get it.
Well, now, you confirmed that, sir. You said that you had confirmed that those reports were true.
Well, I think the reports were true. Within the administration, there has been discussion of a ceasefire, and that confirmed what all the reporters had been writing previously.
Well,
it
your
simply
confirmation,
confirms that the reporters had reported the truth.
Oh, fine. Well, then
So
my
we won't quibble
question
about
is,
it.
my question is that confirmation, if you were president, would you consider that to be some kind of rug pulling if you were in the middle
Not
of
at all.
negotiations?
Absolutely not, because after all, who has backed the president in this particular instance? I have. I'm not the one that has even suggested we should have a bombing halt without conditions. That's Hubert Humphrey. I've been the one that's saying that the president is absolutely correct in saying we shall have a bombing halt, provided it is going to result in saving American lives rather than costing American lives. That's a sound position. I back him up, and I only wish that Hubert Humphrey now would button up his lip and stick with the president on this.
Mr. Nixon, to take another facet of the president's remarks today, He objected to your contention that the United States was not maintaining clear superiority over the Soviet in nuclear weapons. As you know, his Secretary of Defense, Mr. Clifford, has said that we are maintaining parity with the Soviet Union. Do you have information that indicates that the contention of the President and of the Secretary of Defense is incorrect in this area?
Well, I don't know whether they are incorrect, but I do have information backing up what I said. And incidentally, my information comes directly from the Senate Preparedness Committee. You may recall, and this was widely also reported on CBS and in the various newspapers represented here, the Senate Preparedness Committee, of which Senator Stennis is the chairman, and the members include men like Senator Jackson and Senator Symington, who are highly recognized as defense experts. They said just at the latter part of September that it was quite clear that the Soviet Union in certain areas, and I'm quoting exactly, had now surpassed the United States in certain nuclear capabilities. They pointed out, as I did in my statement, that we were still overall ahead. But they also pointed out that the Soviet Union was making alarming gains in this respect. Now, if the Senate Preparedness Committee, a committee controlled by Democrats, with leading Democrats all unanimously signing it, says that, then I think we ought to pay attention to it.
Mr. Nixon, we must interrupt here, I regret. We'll continue the interview with you in a moment. Mr. Nixon, this is a long question, but I think that the only way I can put it to you is to make it long to make it fair.
Fine, I'm used to long questions.
All right, sir. The New York Times, in an editorial yesterday, made two serious allegations against your running mate, Governor Agnew. The Times said, and I quote, his association with the Chesapeake National Bank involves clear and repeated conflicts of interest. It would seem highly improper, the Times goes on, for the governor to continue as a director and stockholder. It notes then when Mr. Agnew was asked about his relationship with this bank 2 years ago, when he, in his gubernatorial campaign, that he had explained he inherited the bank's stock from his father. And the Times then observes it was subsequently learned his father had died a year before the bank opened. That, in fact, Mr. Agnew had purchased the shares himself. And it concludes, Mr. Agnew has demonstrated he is not fit to stand one step away from the presidency. What is your comment on these allegations, sir?
I don't think my answer needs to be quite that long. And incidentally, Martin, I do appreciate the fact that you did state the whole case as you did. Now, the New York Times is a great newspaper. David Broder used to work for the Times. And the New York Times has on its masthead a statement, all the news that's fit to print. This is the lowest kind of gutter politics that a great newspaper could possibly engage in. It is not news that's fit to print, and I'll tell you why. These charges are stale. They were made 2 years ago when Governor Agnew was running for governor. They were answered then. The charges are inaccurate in one major respect with regard to the fact that when the Times claims that Governor Agnew owned the property while he was governor. That was not the case. A retraction will be demanded at the Times legally tomorrow. The retraction will be, I'm sure, printed by the Times, back with the corset ads or with the classifieds toward the end of the week when nobody will pay any attention. Now let's look at the facts. Governor Agnew was nominated for president 3 months ago. The Times has the largest and best paid staff of any newspaper in the country. 1 week before the election, they come up with this last-minute charge. And I think that under the circumstances, the Times owes an apology to its readers, an apology to the American people. If they had this information, why didn't they bring it up sooner? It seems to me that this is certainly something that's below the belt politicking. It certainly is not worthy of a great newspaper like the New York Times. And let me make one other thing clear. Governor Agnew has demonstrated in this campaign that he can do what Harry Truman said a man had to do in politics. He says, if you can't take the heat, get out of the kitchen. He's taken a lot of heat. Governor Agnew, like all candidates, I've made some mistakes. He's made some mistakes. And when he makes them, or I make them, I think we try to get up and say, well, we admit them and we try to correct them. But he's a strong man. He's a man that I'm very proud when stood up at the time that his city, Baltimore, was being burned, and said, look, we're going to rebuild our cities, but we don't have to burn them down in order to rebuild them. He was criticized by some of the all-out civil rights people for that statement. I agree with him on that statement. I think we need that kind of strength and that kind of firmness. And this kind of libel by the New York Times doesn't help the American decision-making process.
Just a clarification, Mr. Nixon, you referred to the fact that he did not own the property while he was during his term as governor. Are you referring to the ownership or membership in the board of directors of the bank that they referred to there, or is this another transaction that you're referring to?
I'm referring, Mr. Broder, to the property referred to in the editorial.
No, the editorial refers
The
to the
question-
shares that are owned.
Shares in
shares
the bank
that are owned.
and membership in the board of directors
Let
of the bank.
me make one thing very clear. A retraction will be demanded legally tomorrow, and I think it will speak for itself. And as far as the legal matters are concerned, I'm not going to do anything that might injure Mr. Agnew's case with regard to the Times. And I hope he doesn't have a case, because I'm sure the Times is a great newspaper, will retract. I would also point out, Dave, that Ben Franklin, one of the more respected reporters, 3 weeks ago wrote this whole story and said that scores of reporters were digging into Agnew's relations here and had not been able to find anything that was particularly useful from a political standpoint. I'm rather surprised that the editorial board of the Times didn't read their news stories.
In the subject of Mr. Agnew, I know you have defended him repeatedly and backed him up when he has come under criticism from the press, and have insisted in a number of interviews that he is an asset in your campaign. Yet in 2 days of covering you this past week, when I must have heard you make a dozen speeches, I did not hear you mention his name. Is there some reason for that?
No, there's no reason for it. I suppose that a presidential candidate doesn't even mention his own name. I don't go out and say vote for Nixon. I go out and talk about the issues. But let me make one thing very clear. You may recall Mr. Agnew's name was first raised in a conversation I had with you. You were the only man in the press corps who even thought that he might be selected as vice president. I've been watching him for a long time. I watched him during this campaign. I think he's handled himself well, and I'm very proud to be on the ticket with him. He's going to make a fine vice president, and I think the fair-minded members of the press are going to think more of him as they see him stand up under pressure.
Mr. Nixon, yes, early in this campaign, Senator Strom Thurmond said that your views on law and order, one of the major issues in this campaign, were similar to those of George Wallace. Later, at a news conference in the Disneyland Hotel, you did not take an opportunity to repudiate Mr. Thurmond's statement, but restated your own position as well. Is it your intention that Mr. Thurmond's unchallenged statement offer hope to potential voters of George Wallace, that they can see in you what they find in Mr. Wallace?
Let me get one thing very clear. My position with regard to the Wallace candidacy is clear. It is not I who is trying to get George Wallace the national television exposure that Hubert Humphrey's trying to get him through a debate, a three-way debate. I recognize that if that should happen, that it would mean that George Wallace would have a hand in naming the next president of the United States.
Well, is Thurmond wrong?
And as far as Thurmond is concerned, I'll answer. As far as Thurmond is concerned, I made it also very clear in that press conference, as you may remember, because I think you asked the question. I made it very clear that Senator Thurmond on Meet the Press, your rival program, had made it clear that he completely disagreed with me on civil rights. As far as this problem of law and order is concerned, I am for law and order. Hubert Humphrey is for law and order. George Wallace is for law and order. How we would do it would be quite different. And as far as my program is concerned, I am the only one of the candidates who has laid out a precise program for stopping the rise in crime and for reestablishing freedom from fear. That's the difference between Nixon and Wallace.
So Senator
Wallace
Thurmond
is against, I am for. That's the difference.
Now, in Atlanta, you did say that you and Wallace were against some of the same things in a regional broadcast
Yes.
to the South. You have also said in the South and in other places that you would not enforce or encourage desegregation by the use of denial of federal funds. Are you concerned, Mr. Nixon, that some people might think that you and Wallace agree on the matter of desegregation?
I'm only concerned that the people understand what is the law and what my position is. The law says specifically that funds shall not be withheld from a district for the purpose of creating racial balance. The law says that funds shall be withheld from a district which does segregate. I believe that the Office of Education should carry out the law and not go beyond it. That's why, for example, on the matter of segregation, desegregation, I don't think funds should be denied to a district on the busing issue. I'm against busing. I do not believe that it serves education to pick up children that are 2 or 3 years behind children in another school district and haul them for a half hour across town to another district. I'm not for that kind of compulsory integration. I am against segregation, and no funds should be given to a district which practices segregation. but I do not believe that the federal power should be used, as the law specifically points out, for the purpose of creating racial balance.
Mr. Nixon, to turn to another issue, you said in a radio speech this week that the United States must maintain clear superiority over the Soviets in nuclear weapons, and indicated that a nuclear weapons buildup would be necessary in this area, in naval nuclear power and all that sort of thing. Now, experts estimate that this would cost somewhere in the neighborhood of tens of billions of dollars. Hubert Humphrey today estimated it would cost at least $50 billion. Now, you're calling at the same time for major economies in federal expenditures and repealing the surtax after the war, increasing Social Security benefits. Where would the money come from?
Let's begin with where we're going to get the money. First of all, there's going to be at least a $15 to $17 billion increase in revenue because of growth in the economy. Second, I believe we're going to have savings through the new kind of programs that I have indicated that will probably amount reach the neighborhood of between $4 and $6 billion. We now come to $21 billion.
Is that
Third,
per year,
as far,
sir? Is that per year?
That's per year, yes. That's in terms of consolidation of agencies and so forth, and also some programs, particularly in the poverty area, like the Job Corps, that I think should be dispensed with. And finally, as far as the cost is concerned, I've costed out all my programs. I'm quite aware of the fact that I might be the next president. I know that my first job is going to be able to prepare a budget. My total increase, as far as all spending programs are concerned, would be approximately $10 billion a year. And I should also point out that Hubert Humphrey, when he talks about what this program would cost, he really isn't much of an expert. He's a man who already has come out for programs that would add $70 billion to our total spending. If you want to start, the Kerner Committee report would cost $15 billion. His new Marshall Plan to the cities would cost $30 billion. His new program that would bankrupt the Social Security system would cost another $15 billion. And the other miscellaneous program would cost $15 billion more. I'm simply pointing this out. The major difference, perhaps, between a Nixon presidency and a Humphrey presidency is that he has been known as a big spender, the most expensive senator. He would be our most expensive president. I would not be. But I'm going to see to it that the United States remains first as far as our defense is concerned. And we can do that, not at a cost of $50 billion. We can do that at the cost that I've indicated.
You don't think that to achieve the nuclear superiority that you seek would cost $50 billion, is that it?
Martin, let me make one thing very clear. I'm not talking about the nuclear superiority that we left at the time that Eisenhower left office, 9-1 in certain areas. What I am talking about is simply an overall superiority, which is essential for this purpose, not for the purpose of waging a war, but for the purpose of defense, and overall to make sure that the next president will be able to negotiate as he must from a position of strength and not from weakness. That's what we're talking about. This isn't going back to the awesome superiority we had before. But we have to remember we are in a race. The other side's running, we're walking. We've got to be sure we stay ahead.
Well, sir, I wish we could continue. Unfortunately, we have run out of time. Thank you very much for being here, Mr. Nixon, to Face the Nation. A word about next week's guest in a moment.
Today on Face the Nation, Richard M. Nixon, Republican candidate for president, was interviewed by CBS News correspondent John Hart. David Broder, national political reporter of the Washington Post. CBS News correspondent Martin Agronsky led the questioning. Today's interview was brought to you by the Masonite Corporation, where the resource is timber and the product is imagination. Next week at our regular time, Senator Eugene McCarthy of Minnesota will face the nation. CBS News correspondents discuss the candidates on a Campaign 68 special this Tuesday night. Face the Nation originated in color from CBS New York.